This lecture is about Rodgers and Hammerstein, probably the most famous collaborators in the American theater. And they gave us some shows that I'm sure you've heard of before, a long list of them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about several of them during this module. Rodgers and Hammerstein were the composer and lyricist, respectively, Richard Rodgers with the music and Oscar Hammerstein with the lyrics, to Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, a show called Flower Drum Song, and finally The Sound of Music in 1960. In addition to that, there are many other Rodgers and Hammerstein songs and shows. These are probably the most famous. But look at this. This is a long list to have to be the best of the best. That's sort of the kind of quality of work you're looking at with Richard Rodgers. If you'll remember from last time, Richard Rodgers had a 25-year career working with Lawrence Hart, who was very talented, but also very self-destructive. And after Hart's death in the early 1940s, Rodgers was left with the obligation to finish a show called, first called Green Grow the Lilacs, later retitled Away We Go, a show to help a company called the Theater Guild out of insolvency. Because so many people were resting on it, even though Rodgers was in a lot of grief over the semi-suicide, or at least unfortunate death of his writing partner, he turned to somebody that he had met earlier in his life, a man named Oscar Hammerstein, who had judged, among other things, a writing contest when Richard Rodgers was much younger, and had, everybody has those sort of people, I guess, that just turn up in your life and cross paths with you over and over again, and you feel like, I'm somehow destined to know this person. That's how Rodgers felt about Hammerstein. Oklahoma, in 1943, is, like I said, one of the, probably one of the most important musicals ever written. And for a lot of reasons, it's an extraordinarily well-structured piece. And I'm going to talk to you in a few minutes about the structure and why that's so interesting. It also really finally firms up the format, the style, the pattern that we consider the American musical, including an overture which gives us a medley of songs that we're going to hear as the night goes on, a two-act format, a major dance portion of the show. Again, Richard Rodgers was one of the first people to hire a choreographer and bring him on board as a major part of the creative team. And that was no exception with Oklahoma. They got Agnes DeMille, who was probably one of the most important choreographers of the day. The nature of this piece, well, this is Hammerstein from his memoirs. He writes, "Such a course as we were writing was experimental. It amounted to a breach of implied contract with the musical comedy audience. Once we had made a few decisions, everything seemed to work right. We had the confidence that people feel when they have adopted the direct and honest approach to a problem. The fact is, Oklahoma has a few laughs, but it's not a comedy. It's not particularly funny. It also doesn't have showgirls. It doesn't have that tap dancing element that shows of the 20s and 30s so frequently had. It's set very much, it's a very American show, and in that sense it kind of portrays an America, it catches America's eye at right around the right time in its development. Oklahoma itself is set, well, in Oklahoma, and it's set at a time when Oklahoma is a territory and not a state. It wants to become a state in part by increasing its population and by industrializing it and farming it. At the same time, it comes out, the musical, at a time when America is sort of deciding it's going to have a bigger place in the world. It's during World War II, America is deciding, well, we're going to intervene in foreign affairs. Sometimes we have to, especially if we're attacked. But in any case, America takes on that element of responsibility. Now, you look at the nascent kind of coming-of-age America in the plot, and the kind of coming-of-age America that it was playing to in its audience, in its world. And it's interesting that the plot itself is very coming of age. It's a piece about a young lady deciding for herself, who am I going to be? How am I going to grow up and mature? It's very much a coming of age piece about its characters, as they also wrestle, quite honestly, with sexual maturity and with relationships, and also with moral responsibility. And all of that has these characters kind of taking different paths to the same end and learning what their decisions about that are going to be. I know that sounds kind of broad, so like I said, I do want to talk a little bit about the plot to Oklahoma and how it is structured. Oklahoma takes as its main structure two major love triangles that sort of fit in dovetail with each other. You don't really think about this if you're sitting watching it or performing in it, but Oklahoma is very uniquely put together. First, in order to talk about that, I want to mention these two types of characters. We've touched on this before, I believe, a few times. We have in a lot of operetta, in a lot of opera, and in a lot of musicals, two real kind of iconic types of characters. You have your ingenue characters, and you have your soubrette characters. Let's talk about the ingenue first. The average ingenue character is going to be written for soprano. If it's a woman's part, it's going to be written for tenor, or baritone in some cases for a man. These are characters who stand to learn something in the course of action of the plot. They're also much more innocent, and they're much more of the traditional hero and heroine that you might associate with an old-fashioned story. Now, you contrast that with what we call the soubrette characters. Actually, I think between you and me, soubrette characters are a heck of a lot more fun to play. Maybe that's just my bias. But soubrette characters are, among other things, what we call character actors, and they're also the comic relief. They're also usually written for either the alto or the lower range, a woman's voice in particular. These characters don't necessarily have to be glamorous or beautiful, but they get a lot of heart and they get an awful lot of the comic relief in the show. In the case of Oklahoma, you have a cut and dried example of this, probably more than any other show. Oklahoma centers around a lot of conflict between farmers and cowmen, between people who want to farm the land and people who want to raise cattle. And there's a lot of fighting about the land. Lori, the main soprano ingenue lead character in the show, she lives on a farm, and she flirts back and forth and kind of pretends she doesn't like, which means she likes, Curly, who is the sort of typical ingenue male character, this handsome, good-looking young fellow who comes over and offers to do the chores sometimes and help out. Now, he is a cowman. Maybe this is sort of a Romeo and Juliet relationship. People don't notice that as well. The primary conflict in their story has to do with Judd. And Judd is a character who really represents, among other things, I think, arrested development of maturity. Judd is that guy who stares at girls just a second or two longer than he has any right to. Judd, it is portrayed in the play, has a collection of not terribly polite photos and pictures and things in his shed where he lives as a handyman on Lori's farm. Lori made the mistake one day of bringing Judd soup and being nice to him when he was sick, and Judd's kind of taken that as like a reason to be fascinated with her. And to this end, Judd sort of pursues her relentlessly for far less noble reasons than perhaps Curly does. A lot of the story in their case revolves around an event that you hear about in these turn-of-the-century Western towns called the Box Social. Box Social was a case where, let's say there's a school being built, a barn, something, in a small rural town, and every woman in the town makes a box lunch, and every man in the town bids for the right to eat the box lunch with that particular person under a tree someplace. And a lot of wives and girlfriends, I'm sure, would say, remember, honey, mine's the one with the purple ribbon, so that the person bids on the right one. Judd has been saving up his money forever so that he can bid and outbid Curly and get his moment alone with Lori. A lot is left unsaid there, but Curly is willing to auction off most of his possessions, including things he needs to make a living, just to outbid Judd and make sure that Judd does not have that moment. That's the ingenue plot, and at the same time you have the soubrette plot between a character named Ado Annie, Will Parker, and a traveling salesman named Allie Hacken. And Ado Annie is perhaps, as the comic relief, it's often said she has a popular song on the show called I Can't Say No, and she has an affinity for kissing fellas behind various trees, and talks about how it's just mean not to let everybody kiss you if they want to. And in Ado Annie's case, I tend to think that she might actually be the more innocent of the characters, because I don't think she really knows what she's always getting herself into. She has a boyfriend named Will Parker, who's not the smartest bulb in the light bulb box, and he can't quite get a dowry together to offer in order to marry her. He goes off to the World's Fair at one point, comes back with all sorts of gifts for her, money that he probably could have spent on this required dowry. While he's away, a traveling salesman comes by, thinks he's getting his chance to be alone with Annie. They get caught by Annie's dad and Annie's dad's shotgun, and he insists that they should get married instead. Most of the plot with these characters is Will Parker returning, selling off the gifts, in some cases to Allie Hackham, who doesn't want to be married any more than Ado Annie wants to marry him, so that there can be money for this dowry so that they can get married. A lot of this has underneath it as its base this sort of what kind of a person do you want to be when you grow up kind of a thing, whether it's characters like Judd and even Allie Hackham in a comic sense, who are very irresponsible with relationships and have a very stunted view of them, or you have characters like Curly and even Will, who are very naive, but eventually learn the real value of what's important. And then you have characters like Laurie and Annie, who are trying to decide what to do in their lives and trying to decide, you know, what kind of girl do you want to be, as the phrase would say. I realize that that's sort of a very Freudian interp in some cases, but it speaks to not only the personality of the characters, but the personality of the audience that was watching in so many respects. Laurie makes up her mind between Curly and a brief, you can't think that she's ever tempted to be with Judd, but she has a dream. There's a dream sequence where she imagines life with Judd, which is very, very tawdry and almost abusive, and she imagines life with Curly, and in her dream, Judd actually kills Curly. In real life, Curly, allegedly by accident, his knife fell on him, kills Judd. Point being that there's this ballet, that's how the dream is expressed. Huge 10-minute ballet in the middle of a musical. No words at all. Oscar Hammerstein as lyricist takes a break, sort of. Agnes DeMille does all the heavy lifting as far as the storytelling goes. This is also original, new, and different for this particular genre. Oklahoma had a lot going against it. I mean, if you think about Rogers working with a new collaborator, and you think about this rather complicated and sometimes psychological plot, and the fact that there's not a whole lot of comedy, and there's people in sort of overalls and cowboy outfits and not dressed in sequins and fancy, dance costumes. Nonetheless, it was beyond a smash. It becomes the first musical to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, an award up to that point only given out to non-musical plays. It's been called a folk opera. It had a Broadway run in its first initial run of 5 straight years. The entire score was also recorded. This makes Oklahoma a first for another reason. It is the first Broadway show to have its own cast album. The Oklahoma cast album was a collection of all the original singers from the cast, as you'd think, in a studio, recreating some of the songs. It's actually quite the collector's item if you can get your hands on an Oklahoma cast album. It's a huge box for the 33 vinyl record, and it has sort of a barn door that opens the 2 sides and pictures on the inside of all these cast members. The package alone is brilliant. It kind of precurses the fact that Rogers and Hammerstein were wonderful businessmen, and you get an awful lot of indication down the road that they knew how to package and market musicals, and that was a very successful thing for them as well. Well, you know, Richard Rogers originally said, okay, I did this and I'm done. I want to walk away from this world, especially after the tragedy with Lawrence Hart. But Oklahoma was so successful for him that he had to rethink that and came back to Oscar Hammerstein and said, maybe we should work together regularly. Maybe I can do this again. And Hammerstein kind of said that, well, I was one step ahead of you and I knew you were going to come to that conclusion. And together, they began working on a follow-up to Oklahoma. That follow-up came in 1945. It's a piece called Carousel. And for some people, it can be very hard to warm up to Carousel. Carousel has some very, very heavy content and some very dark overtones. It has some beautiful music, and it has been revived successfully over the years. It seems to have been a little bit ahead of its time. But a lot of people wondered if Rogers and Hammerstein were going to move away from what they did with Oklahoma or embrace it more. The latter seems to be the case. This is the big contribution of Richard Rogers and Oscar Hammerstein, and it starts with Oklahoma. It is the notion of the dramatic narrative as a musical. The notion that a musical can have characters who develop over the course of time. Now, you saw some of this in Showboat, and I realized Showboat was sort of way ahead of its time. You see it sort of recede when we have shows like, Annie Get Your Gun, or some of the Gershwins and the Porters. They're kind of cartoons. But with Rodgers and Hammerstein, we have a theme in the show, we have characters in the show that develop, but most importantly, we have dramatic content. We have scenes that are not comedy and that are not escapist. Also, with Rodgers and Hammerstein, choreography helps tell the story. It's not just a distraction or window dressing or something that kind of happens in tandem with everything else. Carousel is a piece that is set actually in New England, and it's the story of one very important character named Billy Bigelow. It's a little bit dark. Billy Bigelow works as the barker in a carnival, working literally on a carousel in a New England town, and he's kind of sexist. He's very sexist, and he has an entire song where he sings about how great it's going to be that his son, who's soon to be born in his that his wife's going to have a baby. So the first half of his song is all about the things his boy is going to do. This boy can be the boss, be the president of something if he wants to be, and all these other things. Exactly halfway through the song, and you can even count the measures, he has this moment where he says, oh no, what if it's a girl? And then he's like, well, you can be a pal to a son, but you gotta protect a girl. You gotta be a father. And then he's worried. In his own strange way, it's kind of, I don't want to go so far as to call it noble, but he says he's not worthy of having a daughter. He's afraid that he's kind of a low character, and that this girl should be placed in this pedestal. Most of his musings are in one very, very long song, which we call the soliloquy. You will find soliloquies in several Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. The King and I, Carousel, both come to mind. Now, you may have heard the phrase soliloquy in perhaps a Shakespeare class or a place where they talk about Shakespeare, where you hear, oh, soliloquy, when one character talks all by himself or herself on stage. To be or not to be, that is the question, where there's no living heart and mind and all that. And that's true, but more importantly in the theater, a soliloquy also helps a character work through a problem that he or she has and arrive at a conclusion. It's not enough for Hamlet to say, should I commit suicide or not? He goes through a series of outcomes and a series of thoughts about it, and then he finally decides at the end what he's going to do next. I realize people think of Hamlet as this decisive character, but he, like all Shakespearean characters, uses soliloquy to arrive at a conclusion. Mostly a soliloquy is structured, I have this problem. I could do this, I could do this, or I could do this. Here are the consequences if these things happen. Oh, I know, I'll do this. And then they move on. And that's also true with the soliloquies and the songs of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Billy Bigelow's soliloquy is long. I do not recommend it as an audition piece. It is an incredibly taxing and lengthy song that is, well, frankly, you need to be able to take the audience on that entire journey. And sometimes that can run over 10 minutes. In the case of Carousel, Billy Bigelow thinks that in order to be a better father, he should be involved in a robbery, trying to get money for his daughter. And he dies. And you would think that would be the end. It's kind of the beginning. He gets sent to this sort of purgatory, and he gets offered a very limited amount of time to come back to Earth to set some things right that have gone wrong as sort of a spirit. In the meantime, his daughter has kind of grown up with a real chip on her shoulder. Perhaps one of the most controversial things about Carousel has to do with Billy becoming so frustrated with his daughter and so unable to reach her because he's now a ghost and invisible that he slaps her. Well, sort of. He's a ghost, so it passes through her. But it seems to have this effect. She has this chilling line where she more or less says to her mother, did you ever have someone hit you and hit you hard, but because you love them, you don't feel it? Her mother says, yeah, I've had that. And people have wondered for many years, and people have portrayed that scene in many different ways, and it's a dark scene. It's a very serious moment. It's also a very serious moment for Broadway, because again, these aren't escapist shows. They have real issues and real content. And very soon, with one of their next shows, Rodgers and Hammerstein would tackle probably one of, particularly Oscar Hammerstein's, biggest concerns, something he cared about very deeply, and that's racism. And that comes up again and again in later plays of theirs. With the next section, after this break, we'll talk about a show that deals with that topic called South Pacific, and some other Rodgers and Hammerstein pieces.